Hello, I'm Grayson Carter, and today we visit the Church in Asia. Asia is the world's largest continent with about 4.5 billion people, located in some 50 countries. It has a long and rich history, and its diversity is enormous. All of this poses challenges to attempt to generalize briefly about the history of the Church in Asia. What we do know is that in 2014, a survey found that there were about 364 million Christians in Asia, or about 13% of the overall population. We begin by looking at the history of the Church in East Asia, which here refers to China, Japan, and Korea. We will then turn to the history in South and Southeast Asia. Of course, the history of the Church in each of these regions and individual countries differs considerably. It's believed that Christianity first arrived in East Asia through overland trade routes, the Silk Road, which dates back to the 3rd century BC, being the most famous of these. The history of Christianity in China is long and complex. There's a lot we don't know about it. To understand this momentous event, we must go back in time, briefly to an earlier period. Specifically to the 7th century, if not earlier, when Christianity first arrived in China. It's traditionally held that the earliest Christians in China were Nestorians, probably from Syria or Persia, though some archaeological evidence of a 1st century Christian presence in China has recently been claimed. Now, Nestorians accepted the Christological heresy that emphasizes the disunion of Christ's human and divine natures, and it was condemned by the important Council of Chalcedon in 451. Estimates of Christianity's early influence in China vary greatly, but it appears that a monastery was established during the Tang dynasty, which existed between 618 and 907. At least one ancient source also claimed that the translation of the Old and New Testaments into Chinese first occurred during this time, although there's no evidence of this. We also see that there's claims that there was other monasteries or additional monasteries established during this time. In 845, however, an imperial edict forbidding all foreign religions was issued, and Christianity either vanished or went underground. The Mongol conquest of China in the 13th century provided an opportunity for the reappearance of the Christian faith. Franciscan friars sent by the Pope as missionaries soon arrived, though in 1369 their presence ended when the new Ming Emperor outlawed Christianity. During the 16th century, Jesuits were allowed to reside in China, establishing a more or less continuous Catholic presence in the country ever since. Eastern Orthodox missionaries arrived in China in the late 17th or early 18th century. Today, it's estimated that there are about 20,000 Orthodox Christians in China, mostly in the northeast of the country. The first Protestant missionary in China was the Anglo-Scottish Presbyterian minister Robert Morrison, who arrived in 1807. He baptized his first convert in 1814. During the 27 years he spent in China, often living under exceedingly difficult and even dangerous conditions, he wrote and published a dictionary of the Chinese language, which took 16 years to complete. He founded the Anglo-Chinese College at Malacca in 1818. He established a health clinic at Macau in 1820. And he labored hard and long on the first translation of the scriptures into Chinese, which took him 12 years to complete. During the 19th and 20th centuries, there was an immense focus of missionary activity in China, led by the British and the Americans. In addition to their work of evangelization, they established numerous schools, clinics, and hospitals, which contributed considerably to the conversion of many throughout China. The period between 1901 and 1937 is often regarded as something of a golden age of Christianity in China, with numerous missionaries, many new converts being made, new churches built and established, and with the emergence of an indigenous Chinese leadership. The year spanning 1937 to 1949, however, was marked by the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese Civil War, and the establishment of the communist government. Each of these proved a great challenge to the continuation, even the survival, of Christianity in China. Though in being cut off from the outside world, it did not necessitate the emergence. It did necessitate the emergence of indigenous Christian leadership and self-support, which was very helpful in the upcoming years. Between 1949 and 1976, Christianity in China remained largely cut off from the rest of the world. This isolation and even persecution was even greater during the Cultural Revolution, which took place between 1966 and 1976, when Christianity was banned and when many educated people were imprisoned, sent to work camps, or put to death. Beginning in the late 1970s, the door to freer religious expression began to open, marking the beginning of a period of tremendous growth in the Christian church in China. Although accurate estimates are difficult to come by, in 2010, the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life estimated that there were over 67 million Christians in China, including at least 57 million Protestants and 9 million Catholics. In recent years, the Chinese government has attempted increasingly to keep a tight rein on religious activities. Many Protestants belong to the officially recognized bodies, that is, either the Three-Step Church, as it's called, or the Chinese Christian Council, while other Chinese Christians belong to various unofficial and thereby illegal house churches, which probably look something like the church we see here. The official Catholic body is known as the Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association, which, while supported by the Chinese government, is not officially recognized by the Vatican. Closer ties between the Chinese government and the Vatican have emerged under Pope Francis, but not official cooperation. Some Catholics adhere to underground churches, which are allegedly loyal to the Vatican, though they remain unstructured and officially outlawed. For a variety of reasons, including Japan's well-known attempts to remain isolated from the Western or wider world, Christianity arrived in Japan much later than it did in China. In the 16th century, however, Portuguese traders finally brought the gospel to Japan. This occurred through the efforts of Jesuit, Franciscan, and Dominican missionaries who proved effective in evangelizing the Japanese. At the height of Catholic influence during the 16th century, there were around 300,000 Christian converts throughout Japan. In 1614, however, the Japanese leaders turned against the so-called foreign religion and began to persecute Christians. The number of Christians was quickly reduced, and it has never really recovered. Christianity was officially allowed to return to Japan in 1873, but the number of Christians has remained small. Today it's estimated that there are approximately 1 to 2 million Christians in Japan, or about 1% of the population. Many of them would be immigrants. The history of Christianity in Korea followed a very different path. The first known Koreans to have been converted to Christianity were prisoners held in Japan after the Japanese invasion of Korea at the end of the 16th century. It's also known that there were Korean envoys in Beijing, China, during the 18th century who encountered Jesuit missionaries there and were converted. Perhaps instrumental in this, these envoys had obtained Christian books that had earlier been translated into Chinese. It's known that at least one Korean convert was baptized in Beijing in 1784. Although the Confucian rulers of Korea opposed the introduction of any foreign religion, by the end of the 18th century there were several thousand Christians living in Korea. The Roman Catholic Church began its official outreach to Korea in 1831, with missionaries arriving 4 years later. During the late 19th century, there were various waves of persecution of Catholic Christians in Korea, with many thousands being martyred. By 1900, only about 1% of the population in Korea was Christian. A wave of Protestant missionary activity soon followed. The first Protestant converts were baptized in Manchuria in 1876 by Scottish missionaries. In the following decade, Western powers convinced government officials to grant freedom of religion throughout Korea. The history of Christianity in Korea followed a different path. The first known Koreans to have been converted to Christianity were prisoners held in Japan after the Japanese invasion of Korea at the end of the 16th century. It is also known that there were Korean envoys in Beijing, China during the 18th century who encountered Jesuit missionaries there and were converted. Perhaps instrumental in this, these envoys had obtained Chinese books that had been earlier Christian books that had earlier been translated into Chinese. It's known that at least one Korean convert was baptized in Beijing in 1784. Although the Confucian rulers of Korea opposed the introduction of any foreign religion, by the end of the 18th century there were several thousand Christians living in Korea. The Roman Catholic Church began its official outreach to Korea in 1831, with missionaries arriving 4 years later. During the 19th century, there were various waves of persecution of Catholic Christians in Korea, with many thousands being martyred. By 1900, only about 1% of the population in Korea was Christian. A wave of Protestant missionary activity soon occurred, however. The first Protestant converts were baptized in Manchuria in 1876 by Scottish missionaries. In the following decade, Western powers convinced government officials to grant freedom of religion throughout Korea. A wave of Protestant missionary activity soon occurred. The first Protestant converts were baptized in 1876 by Scottish missionaries. In the following decade, Western powers convinced government officials to grant freedom of religion throughout Korea. This led to a wave of Protestant missionary activity, mainly American Methodist and Presbyterians. The latter, Presbyterians, who adopted the principles of self-support, quickly became the largest Christian church in Korea. At the end of World War II, the Korean peninsula was divided along the 38th parallel. The Communist North then set out to abolish all religious practices and affiliations, forcing many Christians to flee south, and perhaps some others to practice their faith secretly. Although North Korea used to be the heartland of Korean Christianity, today no one knows how many Christians continue there. But what about South Korea? How many Christians are there in South Korea? Although this is difficult to pin down, the Pew Research Center estimates that in 2010, about 29% of the population of South Korea were Christians. 18% were Protestants, and about 11% were Catholics. Besides numerous other Protestant churches, this includes the world's largest Pentecostal church, the Yeodo Full Gospel Church, which is in Seoul. It also includes the world's largest Presbyterian church, the Mueang-sung Presbyterian Church, also in Seoul, which has about 100,000 members. In recent years, there have been moderate growth among Roman Catholicism in Korea. The continued growth of Protestantism, however, seems to have stalled due to a number of factors, including clergy scandal and corruption, a lack of unity among Korean Christians, pressure from fringe religious groups such as the Unification Church, and too close and unhealthy ties to corrupt government officials. A final factor of note is the extensive Korean missionary activity throughout many parts of the world. At present, there are over 10,000 Korean missionaries working in over 160 different countries. There are approximately 24 million Christians in India, representing about 2.3% of the population. As such, it's the third largest religion in India. By tradition, the Apostle Thomas founded the church in South India around AD 52, but this remains a debated point. What we know for sure is that Christianity came to India from Syria by the 4th century, perhaps a little earlier, where it established, as in China, a Nestorian church. This same church today is known as St. Thomas Christians, or the Mar Thoma Church, and it's no longer Nestorian. It represents the oldest form of known Christianity in India. The largest body of Christians in India, however, are Roman Catholics, first brought to the subcontinent by the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama in 1498, who settled in Goa in the far south of India. The Dutch took control of the area in 1660 and drove out the Portuguese everywhere except in Goa. In 1757, the English East India Company assumed control of northeast India. Although firmly opposed to the presence of missionaries, they eventually were allowed, having been forced by the British government under the influence of William Wilberforce. The first English missionary to arrive in India, and arguably the most famous missionary in modern history, was the Baptist William Carey, who arrived in 1793. He remained active in missionary work in India until his death in 1834. And then, in the 19th century, American Protestant missionaries also began to arrive in India. Though numerically small, the influence of Anglicanism in India is significant, especially through the United or Ecumenical Church of South India, established in 1947. Despite the fact that India is officially a secular democratic country, with religious freedom embedded in its constitution, there has been of late considerable religious discrimination against Christians in the Christian church. In recent years, thousands of churches have been burnt. Many Christian leaders have lost their lives. Nuns have been raped, and tens of thousands of Christians have been driven from their homes. This persecution is due mostly to the rise of Hindu nationalism or fundamentalism, which has grown significantly of late. With a few exceptions, Christianity is disproportionately spread throughout the rest of South and Southeast India. The Christian faith was introduced to the Philippines by the Spanish in the early 16th century, and in East Timor by the Portuguese around the same time. East Timor is actually the most Catholic country in the world, where 97% of its population are Roman Catholics, at least after the Vatican. The Philippines is almost 90% Christian. 80% of those are Roman Catholics. As such, it is the largest Christian nation in Asia. Though there's some suggestion of earlier Christian activity in Indonesia, it was only in the 16th century that Catholic missionaries from Portugal established the first permanent church there. Protestant missionaries arrived in the 19th century. Some of these proved extremely successful, and Christianity grew rapidly. It's now the second largest religion in Indonesia, comprising some 11% of the population, 70% of whom are Protestants. The circumstances surrounding the history of Christianity in Malaysia are similar, but more complex. About 10% of the population is Christian, though ethnically and geographically it's limited, being prohibited among the majority of Malays and concentrated in East Malaysia. Christianity was first brought to Malaysia in the early 7th century, and later in the 15th century by Portuguese missionaries. Protestant missionaries from Holland first arrived there in the 17th century. British missionaries were particularly active in East Malaysia during the 19th century. Today, numerous restrictions on the practice and spread of Christianity exist in Malaysia.